I'm John Maucheri, the Chancellor. This is Jamie Bernstein, the first child of Felicia and Leonard, and their baby boy here, Alexander, and Sid Raymond, who I'll tell you more about in a moment. But Sid was helped Leonard Bernstein, along with Irv Kostal, in orchestrating West Side Story in 1957, and Sid is one of the great orchestrators of the 20th century, having orchestrated so many shows on Broadway and worked in Hollywood and helped create the sound of West Side Story. So it's, of course, a privilege to have them up here with us. Let's start. Sid, you're the person who probably in this room knew Lenny the longest. When did you meet Leonard Bernstein?
Well, I met Lenny when we were both 12. And
speak into your mic.
We were immediately attracted to each other because he was a great teacher and I was a very bad student, but a very good listener. And he taught me everything I ever learned about music. And that's not an exaggeration, really.
Sid, where did you meet when you were 12 years old?
Yes, we were in Boston, and that was in the height of the Depression. And Lenny's family wasn't really affected too much by the Depression, but mine was. And Lenny almost took me over under his arms, actually. And we were playing outside, as kids will do at that time, on the sidewalk. And Lenny said, "You know, I think there's a piano upstairs," and another friend of ours, Eddie Ryak. Does that name sound familiar to you? Yes. And Eddie Ryak had a piano, and Lenny said, "Why don't we go up to Eddie's and we'll sit down and we'll have some fun up there." And Lenny sat down at the piano and started to play, and he said to Eddie, "You know, you ought to learn how to play the piano." And Eddie said, "Well, I wish I could, but I just can't." And Lenny said, "Well, sit down next to me. And this is really, really easy. Just watch what I do." And he started to play "Good Night, Sweetheart." "Good Night, Sweetheart" was a pop song of the day. Nobody here knows that song anymore, but it's a very easy song, and it's diatonic and in the key of C, and anybody could have played it except Eddie Ryak. He stumbled and could not play it, and Lenny was getting irked, and I was getting even more irked because I said, "Well, would you mind if I try to play it?" And Lenny shoved Eddie off the piano bench, and I sat down, and I played "Good Night, Sweetheart" as Lenny had played it. And he said, "Well, you should be the one I should be teaching." And there began a teacher and student relationship that lasted for, well, 70 years, who knows how long it was, until...
Sid, to get you from playing "Good Night, Sweetheart" on that piano to orchestrating West Side Story, I'm sure we don't have time for that whole story, but the question is, when you got the call to do West Side, had you worked orchestrating for Lenny before West Side Story?
No, I had never orchestrated for Lenny. No, I was a pretty good orchestrator.
Yes,
and
I would say so. Yeah.
I was doing a show called the Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle, and that was on Tuesday nights on television at 8, and that was an hour show every single week.
And that was the most popular show on television, I should tell you. And I didn't realize that you were working in television.
Yes, I did that for 8 years.
Wow.
And Lenny called me one morning, and he said, "You know," he called me at 7:30 in the morning. I remember that very, very well. And he said, "You know, I'm going to be doing a Broadway show called West Side Story, and I'd love if you'd orchestrate it." Now, you know, the interesting thing is that in listening to Carol before and everybody else, when you're an actor or an actress, you go after a show and you want to do it so badly and you pursue it. In my case, it came to me. Here was Lenny calling me to do the show. But even then I said, gee, you know, Lenny, I have an hour show to do every single week, and I'm breaking my back now doing it. I don't think I can do it unless I possibly get another friend of mine, Irwin Costal, who's doing a show called Show of Shows, which was also an hour show, and he was breaking his back.
So the two of you were covering Sid Caesar and Milton Berle on
Exactly.
every
So
week.
for a little comic relief, they did West Side Story.
Exactly. Anyhow, to make a long story even more boring, we accepted the assignment and then began orchestrating West Side. And what people don't seem to realize is that we orchestrated West Side Story in under a month, which was pretty fast, considering that Irv was still doing Show of Shows and I was still doing Burl. So it was really a...
Well, when you were getting this is those of you who are in the orchestra know this particularly well, but some of you who will be hearing it tonight may have different ears because of what we're saying. An orchestrator actually is deciding who plays the notes that the composer has written, whether it's a saxophone or whether the chord, which has got 4 notes in it, whether one of those notes is played on a violin, another note is played on a French horn, and how that will actually carry the story forward. What Sid and Irv with Leonard Bernstein did was create the actual oral environment of West Side Story. I mean, there's a musical world involving its harmonies and rhythms, but how that actually sounds, you could play the score on a piano. You could play the score with 12 saxophones or something or other. So what the colors are very specific. And in addition, there was another challenge for you, which was the number of musicians in the pit. Why don't you tell us, this is where your artistry meets the practicality and the limits of a situation.
Well, at that time, there was a union rule that there was a minimum number of players that each theater had to use. And I believe it was the Schubert we opened at had a 25-player minimum, which means that we had to use 25 players. But
it was Winter Garden, was it the Winter Garden Theater, or were you in the Schubert? Winter Garden in New York, yeah.
Winter Garden, okay, great.
Yeah, owned by the Schuberts, but yes, there we go.
Anyhow,
everybody wins.
The reason that I say Schubert was because on the score, we knew that there was some. They used to have walkers. Walkers were the house players. The union demanded that each theater have a minimum amount of players that would just be there at all times, not necessarily play, but they had to be there. And so there were a couple of violin players who were walkers, and Lenny said, well, we'll have to put them into the score. And we used to put a separate line on our score and mark them Schuberts. And put all the uninteresting stuff, or all the stuff that really wouldn't matter if it wasn't played at all, which it never was played properly anyhow. But
Were the walkers in the theater, did they tend to be of a lower musical
Yes.
caliber? Is
much
that the deal?
lower musical talent.
And each
yes.
theater had a different, you had the 2 trumpets at one theater, and this was all part of the weaning of the old school where every theater had an orchestra. And had, people assigned, it just goes back to the time when the king had the King's
Vaudeville,
Orchestra.
too.
Vaudeville, Vaudin. And then, so by the time we're up to this point, there are still walkers. And if you had them in your score, they had to play, or you had to pay them to walk. They had to show up at half hour, but they didn't necessarily have to play.
Hence the name.
But you still had to pay them. And so West Side Story, but when you got to the idea of 7 solo violins.
Well, Lenny wanted more than 25 players, and I believe it was increased to about 28. But even there, we knew that the demands of the orchestra needed a lot more variety than we could have with even 28. So we said, what can we do? And we came up with a brilliant idea, which I think is brilliant, was not using any violas, because the cello could play anything that a viola could play, and so why not? So we dispensed with the violas.
It's the ultimate viola joke.
Right.
Yes, it's the ultimate viola joke.
They're gone.
They're gone, that's right.
Much to the chagrin of the viola player. As a matter of fact, on the following show I did Gypsy, I didn't use violas. And then on the following show, after that, a funny thing happened on my way to the forum. I felt so badly, I didn't use violins, but I used violas.
Yes,
So,
To correct your karma.
but anyhow, those were the demands of the orchestra.
But Sid, then there's the thing about doubling. You know, in our school, although we're playing every note of Sid's orchestration, we are having more than one person read the book, because one book would be a piccolo, a flute, a clarinet, and a saxophone. Only the bassoon book is only bassoon from beginning to end, and I'm sure there's a story about that.
There's a story about it, and the story is just one name, Sandy Sheriff. Sandy Sheriff was a very good friend of Lenny, and he played the bassoon. But he was a classical bassoonist and didn't play anything else. We were used to having doublers. We'd always have guys that could play
The
anything.
bassoon, the saxophone, the piccolo, and the
Exactly.
sackbut.
So we had in our reed section, we had Sandy Sheriff playing only bassoon, and the other guys had to play everything else. They had to play piccolo, flute, oboe, English horn,
Saxophone.
bass clarinet, E-flat clarinet, baritone saxophone, anything we could find. And of course, at that time, we were young and very experimental, and we wanted to use everything we possibly could. And that's where you found your 3 bass clarinets and a bassoon.
Well, this is extraordinary. When I finally saw the score for the first time, because it's engraved, and when I got to a boy like that, and I saw that there were 3 bass clarinets and a bassoon, I mean, this is never in history was the sound ever used. Just like you'll notice, because West Side Story was created in a time when there was a minimal amount of amplification. There might have been some along the foots, or nothing. And what you'll find is that the way Sid and Irv and Lenny orchestrated it is that when people are singing, for the most part, the orchestra is very quiet, and at the place where a singer will breathe after 4 bars, to fill in that breath, the orchestra comes up and you'll hear bum bum, and then it comes back down. These figurations make the song seem seamless. Whereas in film orchestrations, you don't have to do that, because it's simply dialed up and dialed down, because it is completely mixed in the studio. Whereas the live performance requires an amazing amount of balance. And this score is just extraordinary. Sometimes it's 3 flutes quietly underscoring, sometimes the trumpets, and it's really only loud in the dances. And that's where
But you know, the interesting thing in that same venue, actually, Lenny was a wonderful orchestrator in his own right. He really could, he could have done the show himself, except that
time.
However, he wasn't a jazz bow the way we were. And when I use that word, I use it kindly. For example, Officer Krupke, when it goes, Officer Krupke, da-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum. Now, we would put bum, bum is, Irv and I wouldn't even think of it. It's a fill that we just had to fill. Lenny would say, what's that? And I'd say, Lenny, it's a fill. He said, what's a fill? I'd say,
He spelled it P-H-I-L, you see.
Exactly. And he'd say, isn't that wonderful? How'd you think of that? And Irv and I would look at each other and say, wait a second.
It goes back to vaudeville, yes.
Now here's a man who could write cool. The cool fugue is an absolute brilliant fugue that nobody else could have done, but bump, bump suddenly became something that Lenny could not.
How did you discuss the color of each number? I know you always give Lenny a lot of credit for everything you also did, and that's very sweet of you, and I know that it's true because Lenny was a great orchestrator. But did you discuss the quality of each song? Because,
We did
right?
very, very carefully. We had what Lenny called pre-orchestration meetings. And Lenny and Irv and I would sit down. First, Lenny would play it on the piano for us. Then we would sit down and we'd discuss every bar, and we would then decide what we ought to do and mark our parts. Irv and I would then go across the street to my office on 57th Street. We'd sit down and we would orchestrate. And the next day, we would come back and have what Lenny called a post-orchestration meeting. And we would sit down, and there we would hear a lot of very famous words like, "Why did you do that?" Or,
As per his instructions, right?
and then we'd say, "How do you like that, Lenny?" He says, "You know, that's not too bad." But the word that we used to use all the time was, "Will it work?" And Lenny would always say, "Don't worry, it'll work." And we say, "But Lenny, the oboe only goes up to," he said, "Don't worry about it, it will work." And you know, it always worked.
Yes, it's a great achievement, and something that is really an awesome achievement. And for those of us now finally in the middle of working on it every day, it is a monument to your creativity, as well as the creativity in the face of severely limited means, and it's completely amazing. Alex and Jamie, Alex, you were 2 years old, I guess, when West Side Story opened, so I'm going to ask you what it was like opening night.
I remember it exactly.
Jamie, I'll start with you on this, though, but West Side Story had to, even though you were not aware of West Side Story opening, West Side Story had to be part of your lives with your dad. And what are your memories of it insofar as your father's responses to it? Because you weren't there for the world premiere.
Well, Alexander was 2 and I was 5, so we were pretty tiny, and I vaguely remember the collaborators working in the house, always in a big cloud of cigarette smoke. Yes. That's what I mostly remember about our dad writing shows. But we were certainly too young to go to the opening.
But you grew up knowing that your father was the composer of West Side Story, and he had certain...
Yeah. West Side Story is like the fourth sibling in our family. That's
Right.
how we feel about
Absolutely.
it. It's like, you know, this beloved other being that was created by our parent.
Right.
So like really, it's the other sibling.
Where do you think it...
And we see it often.
Yes,
Like you
we
would a
see our sibling all the time.
It must be actually quite moving for you to see it, like in high schools and all kinds of productions. I mean, I think you recently saw it.
High school and college productions are, as far as we're concerned, the best way to see West Side Story, because then the actors are the correct age, for starters. It really is a show about young people and about the feelings that come up when you're young, and so it should be performed by young people. The younger, the better. And so I see it in high schools and colleges all over the country. And
I had the opportunity one time when I was teaching middle school theater, and we had a co-production with the high school, and it was the year after my father died, and so we decided to do a production of West Side Story, and I thought, well, okay, I know that piece. It's my sibling after all, you know. I know it pretty well. Let's do it. Not knowing how difficult a piece it was, because I had just grown up with it. And so getting into it and finding out how hard it actually was an extraordinary experience. And also having that sort of weird opportunity to work with my father in a way was very cool.
What do you remember in discussing with your dad about West Side Story? When he spoke of it, is there anything that you remember about, you know, how it affected, you know, life as, I mean, because it is his most famous work, there's no question, and I'm sure he had very strong feelings about that process.
Well, the truth is that he didn't really become famous for West Side Story nationally and internationally until the movie came out. It was really the movie that put West Side Story into the international consciousness, and mine, and Alexander's too, because we were too young when it came out on Broadway, but when the movie came out, then we were old enough to really get it about West Side Story, and I remember seeing it for the first time and just being beside myself with excitement and saying, I'm going to see this movie 10 times.
Although the original cast album, we used to listen to
that's true. We listened to the album
all the time.
We certainly knew the music
before
back
the
then.
movie came out. So we were
prepped.
Now,
Prepped,
You were
right.
ready.
Now, that leads me to two questions. Your father would say to me about the movie that he really didn't like the movie.
Right,
And
he didn't.
He even said the word, "I hate that movie" for various reasons. And why do you think your father didn't work on the movie? And maybe
Well, Sid, you probably know more about this than we do, right?
Well, first of all, your father was very, very busy, with the Philharmonic. And actually, there is a great irony. Saul Chaplin, who was the associate producer, did most of the legwork there. But the irony here is that when it came time for Oscars, Lenny he wasn't even eligible for an Oscar because it wasn't written for film, it was written for
Broadway, and there was
Broadway.
no category for it.
But I orchestrated it for film, so I got the Oscar, which
Well deserved, I might say.
And well-deserved.
which didn't seem fair to me and still doesn't seem fair to me, actually.
But Sid, a lot of people know West Side Story from the movie, and probably more people know it from the movie than from the show. And when they see the show, they're surprised at the changes that were made to make the movie. And of course, if you know it first as a movie, then you're surprised when you see where cool is and the fact that America has got different lyrics and the boys are in that and all those changes. But you've told me that you feel that those were your great orchestrations for West Side Story. You and Irv seem to. You talk very fondly of them, and they are great. What is that? Why is that? do you
Well,
think?
we just, first of all, here the content, without being orchestrated, is so wonderful. It's just, great. The music was just so wonderful. But something interesting, what most people don't know, because I guess how would they know, is that Irv and I were chafing it at the bit, and we were saying, we have this project in Los Angeles. It's going to be a big, big job, and Johnny Green is going to be the conductor. And I wonder, can we do anything before we go out there? And I said, Irv, how can we possibly know what the instrumentation will be? Irv said, they'll give us anything we want. So I said, well, that sounds good. So we sat down, and I would say that we orchestrated a good quarter of the show before we even went. But we never let anybody know. So when we got to California, the legend came, said, those guys are fast.
And you added violas.
They-
That's the most important thing, isn't it?
But Irv said, we can write for 4 xylophones now if we want to. I said, really? He said, sure. So we wrote for 4 xylophones. And it was like having a...
I'm sorry, go ahead, yes. No, that's actually, when you hear the soundtrack of West Side Story, even though the recording is 40 years old or so, you'll notice the difference with the Broadway orchestration, whereas the Broadway orchestration, which you hear tonight, is ingenious and brilliant and fills a 1,200-seat theater. The orchestrations for the movie, it's probably a 96-piece orchestra, which is really 3 times the size of the Broadway. But the brilliance of what Sid and Irv did is that actually both work completely equally well. And if you're not listening carefully, you would hardly know the difference because of the brilliance of your work. For Lenny's kids, if we're going to say something about Leonard Bernstein, what I know it sounds like a goofy question, but what is that like to have grown up with him? I mean, I know for me, having spent 18 years with him, what do you feel in these kind of instances when you think of Dad? Can you do that?
Well, I don't know. We didn't know any different. Number one, he was
your dad.
Well, he was our dad, and that was it. He was an extremely funny guy, and a lot of fun to hang around with. And he loved hanging around with us, which was very wonderful. When he was around, he traveled a lot, but sometimes he would take us with him, and which was a lot of fun. And but sometimes he'd just be gone for months, but when he was there, he was really there, and he didn't go to an office, so he would work at home, and he didn't mind us bothering him in his studio. If he was
We really
studying
never
for his-
had the feeling that we weren't welcome. He was just always happy to have us around or along if he was on the road. Or even in New York, he would invite us to rehearsals, and he was just always inviting us along on his big adventure in life.
Well, the thing about Lenny that I can say about your dad is that whenever you were with him, you felt this was the only place to be. It was the center of all things. You just wanted to be there.
It was never boring.
Oh, never boring, and sometimes really, really never boring.
But we won't talk about that.
Do you think that the image of West Side Story, in a way, having that success happen to him at that time, that in a way kind of cast a shadow on the works he wrote after that?
That always comes up, and I really don't think so.
Good.
I
That's
really
a good
don't.
answer.
And I've heard people say, he always wished he wanted to be remembered as a more serious composer, and but West Side Story is as serious composing as you can get,
absolutely,
and
right.
he would have said the same thing, and that's what they were after.
Right.
And he did feel pressure as he got older to write more stuff and better stuff, but that would happen no matter what, I think, to any composer.
I think part of the problem was that there was this dichotomy back in the 20th century when he was doing all his composing, that in order to be taken seriously as a serious composer in the second half of the 20th century, you had to write 12-tone music. And that is if you wanted to be taken seriously in academic circles, which was something that really meant a lot to our father. He desperately wanted to be taken seriously by those people. But when you got right down to it, he could not give up writing a tune, for which we are all incredibly grateful.
We are, absolutely. Yeah.
So, but it was at some cost to his own reputation in the halls of academe, where he very much wanted to be taken seriously, but he wasn't going to compromise his own, what was coming out of his composing heart. That's what he was going to do.
And it's not just the halls of academia, because we are, after all, at a school right now, and that has changed somewhat, but it also was the critical world. I mean, they were giving that same stuff to Rachmaninoff, too.
I think that bothered him more than the world of academia,
Right,
is
yes.
the critical world.
Yeah, well, I remember Lenny would say to me that when he was music director of the New York Philharmonic, and they would do their opening concert each week on Thursday, and then there'd be the Friday afternoon concert they called the ladies' matinee. He would wake up every Friday morning and read terrible reviews about his concert the night before, and over his scrambled eggs and pancakes, and then go off and conduct at Carnegie Hall or Philharmonic Hall. And what's really important for us to remember is that although in retrospect, those of us blessed to have known Leonard Bernstein and to now he lives on in this incredible music, but in his life he was quite controversial and frequently got terrible reviews. I mean, really nasty personal reviews, and it's always hard to understand that, but it is
Especially in his hometown.
absolutely.
Where he got the least respect.
Yeah, New York
conducting
City.
the Philharmonic.
Yes, that's quite.
For a man of such an enormous ego, I guess it always goes hand in hand with insecurity, but it really, really got to him.
Yeah, and it was always amazing to me was that when Lenny would come back from a tour and he would tell me about a good review he got in Munich or something or other, I always was amazed. I would think, but you're Leonard Bernstein. What do you care what you got in the review?
Oh, he cared.
He cared, but he really cared. I have here a playbill from February 3rd, 1958 for West Side Story with a lovely picture of Carol Lawrence and Larry Kurt on it. And in it, not only is this from the original run of West Side Story, but there's something called the Playbill Diarist, Leo Lehrman, whose new book just came out of his collected works. And Leo Lehrman is, well, I guess you guys grew up with Leo Lehrman, and he was a columnist and a person who wrote about everything going on in New York. And in these days,
Ran Vogue magazine.
Yep, yes, absolutely. And so this is an article by Leo Lehrman in the West Side Story playbill. And he talks about a dress rehearsal at the Metropolitan Opera for the world premiere of Vanessa, which is an opera by Sam Barber with a libretto by Giancarlo Menotti. And then the second part, he writes this. There was another premiere which involved a composer known to Broadway audiences. But this was a very different one. Precisely at 12 noon on a Saturday, Leonard Bernstein, the new music director and conductor of the New York Philharmonic, opened the Young People's Concert Series. I think it's completely amazing to me to look in this West Side Story program and see that your dad was just now, while it was running on Broadway, was the newly appointed music director of the New York Philharmonic and was starting the Young People's Concerts. Is that just
Wow.
completely wow?
It's
That's a
pretty
wow.
wow.
Unbelievable.
But you know, in that, we were, I guess, in Philadelphia when Lenny got the news that he was, and we were in a streetcar, Irv and I and Lenny went to the back of the streetcar and lie down flat on one of the seats. And I said to Irv, you know, that's the new Philharmonic, that's the new conductor of the Philharmonic lying there in that streetcar.
Well, it was an unprecedented moment and an unprecedented choice. So one, in fact, which has not even been followed since. I have to say that the New York Philharmonic had a young American music director who had a show running on Broadway at the time. I know in the time we have left to us, there must be some questions for our guests up here.
I was wondering, actually, where did the whole, like, where did it originate?
Well, that's the tritone, that's the famous tritone, or the augmented fourth, or the flatted fifth, as they say. But that's the motive that goes through the whole show. As
Yeah,
far
but the question, I think the question that's being asked is, where did that come from?
well, that's a good idea.
Well, should we give the Jack Gottlieb explanation?
Which is the real explanation.
We think it's the
This is
real
the real
explanation.
explanation. Here it is, everyone. Promise not to tell anyone.
It comes from the shofar, the ram's horn, which is blown on the high holy days in synagogues. Oh. There you
Is
go.
that cool or what?
Right. And you know, he used it in Candide, too. It's
Yeah,
in the
it's in
Inquisition.
Candide also. That's right. It's the Inquisition scene. Yeah, and of course the symbolism also in the Christian world is that the tritone is the devil in music. That's what it's called, diabolus in musicum. So it's meant to be the violence. Because the tritone is either it's too big to be a fourth and too small to be a perfect fifth, and it lives somewhere in between
Or,
the devil.
as I like to think of it, if you start with a nice major chord, which everybody can identify, la, 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 right? And then you make that middle note go up a little, la, 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 you get the tritone, and you also get Maria. And that tritone, if you anagram it and turn it around a million ways, you'll find it all over the West Side Story score. And I think of it as that it's the fulcrum on which our dad balanced the tonality versus atonality. So the lovers are leaning towards harmony, and the gangs are veering towards
Chaos.
discord and dissonance, and the whole thing is balanced on the tritone.
Yeah, that was.
Thank you. True.
When this show started, your father was also writing the lyrics, as I understand, and I want to know how far he got with that, how much of his original material is still in it, and where Sondheim. Sometime, your father very graciously decided to give Sondheim the final right to credit for the lyrics, but I just wondered where that stopped, and I know Comedy Green were brought in at one point, and there was a great deal of confusion.
Well, the question is asked about because all of you didn't hear that question. The question is about the transition from when West Side Story was first being written. Leonard Bernstein was the composer and the lyricist. And at some point in there, Steve Sondheim came in to help out. And in the original manuscripts, you will see lyrics by Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim, and then at a certain point it becomes lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. I don't know whether Jerry Friedman has something to say about this, or whether any of you on stage have an answer to this, since you were 2 and you were 5, and I was 10.
But we've read about it. Well, it is true that Steve was brought in at some point because it was just all becoming too big a task for our dad to write the music and the lyrics. I don't know how far along they'd gotten by the time Steve came in, but I do know that there was recently a very interesting exhibit in Carnegie Hall of some early manuscripts in our dad's handwriting of lyrics for West Side Story, and I remember one for Maria that was really not quite as good as the final product. And it goes, Maria, say it loud, and there's music playing. It's a sound like in church when you're praying.
Oh, I see.
Fud.
Thud.
So things really got better along the way.
I think people got smart about asking for help, just like Jerome Robbins got smart and having Jerry Friedman and Peter Gennaro help, and that's the point, is to know your weaknesses so that your strengths can shine. Are there more questions? Jerry Friedman says that...
Because they worked on something together,
Sure.
Arthur and Steve.
Stand up and sing for
They
us.
knew
Sing
each
us
other.
something, Gerald.
Well, Arthur, I think, brought Steve into the mix because it got too big of a task. And there were lyrics that both of them contributed to. I mean, Leonard and Steve. And then I think, yeah, it was a gracious and sensitive thing. Leonard didn't need to be the lyricist of West Side Story and withdrew, as it were. Yeah, did he do, he had done, no, something else, yeah. I mean, they weren't the first lyrics he wrote. First, he did a lot of dummy lyrics all the time, and he wrote songs all the time. So it wasn't strange for him, but he recognized, I think, the magnificent potential in Steve Sondheim and gave it over, which is a wonderful thing. You know, when you meet a fellow artist collaborator that is in simpatico with you and exceeds your talent, it is so easy and wonderful to hand it over. Just for instance, as he did with you and Irv. I mean, he could have orchestrated it, but he knew, you knew, and you were a simpatico artist. And that's the best kind of collaboration.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Yes.
Well, you know, actually, Something's Coming was written out of town, and
Well, something's, I don't mean to interrupt, but Something's Coming was text. It was Arthur Lawrence and Tony spoke it.
Right.
And they needed an opening number for Tony, something that said who he was. And Steve and Arthur, I mean, Steve cannibalized, quite openly, the whole speech. And if you read the original speech, it's almost word for word, but it's not a lyric, and Steve made it a lyric.
My father always talked about how generous Arthur was in that song and throughout the show, that he would write lines and lines of dialogue that would end up as songs. A Boy Like That.
Yeah.
A Boy Like That was originally seen. Yes, a question back there?
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the compare and contrast between the movie and the theater version. I know you've seen both many, many times. What are some of the things you like about the movie as compared to the...
Well, I'll leave that over to Bernstein's to answer.
Carol, also related to that, were you considered at all for the movie? I know Cheetah was.
It's a long story. It's sad. Yes, I was, and I would have given my eye teeth, of course, to do it. I did the audition. I'd never done a screen test, and I was very young and very inexperienced and trying very hard to be most cooperative. And I came in my little, it was the Por favor, Anita, make the neck lower scene. And I wore my original costume. I was working with a lady I'd never met before, very, very nervous. And Jerry Robbins was there, and he came up to me and he said, I want you to do this like a tigress. If she doesn't make that neck lower, you hit her. You just beat her. You just get that neck. I had never played it like that. But I figured, the movie, they want something, I don't know. I would do it any way he wanted, okay? So I said, okay, I can do that, sure. And so as I was walking on, I felt, and here's Mr. Weiss. Hello, Miss Lawrence. I'm Robert Wise. Nice to meet you. I'm going to be co-directing with Mr. Robbins, and I just wanted you to know that I feel Maria is made of gossamer wings. It's fragile like a butterfly speaking. And gently, gently get your way. Now, if I had been smarter and maybe more courageous or whatever the word, those timing, those moments, I would have said, have you guys ever spoken to each other? I mean, are you in any kind of agreement or do you just want me to look like an idiot? And I didn't have the guts to do it, so I went on and I said, por favor, Anita, if you don't make them McLaren, I'm gonna... It was a schizophrenic. I didn't get the part, and I would not have given me the part, because it was just, I don't know. I know that Natalie wanted it, and she was an international star from the time she was a very small child, and she was a wonderful actress, and that she had worked with Robert Wise, and she wanted this part more than anything. She literally took an operation that you can take if you want to, but you don't. What do you call that? Elective surgery to get herself out of the other commitments so she would be free for West Side. That's going a long way. So that's all I have to say.
Wow, that's interesting.
As far as the movie versus the show is concerned, I like the show a lot better. But one thing cool in the movie is fantastic, and I really ended up understanding why they switched Krupke and Cool, and it really does work better in the movie.
But it wouldn't work in the show.
Without a first and second act.
But it certainly wouldn't work in the show. 'cause
It would
they-
never work in the show, no.
But they didn't have the Act 1, Act 2 problem in the movie, so they had the freedom to move things around.
Sure, sure.
My problem with the movie always was it took a rather large effort of the will, which I achieved in working up a little bit of a crush on Richard Beamer, who plays Tony, because he wasn't my ideal Tony, but I managed to work up some enthusiasm for him.
And the biggest problem that I had with the movie was that they're such bad basketball players. It just drove me crazy that they would allow, that Jerry or Robert Wise would allow that to be on film. And, you just lose at the beginning. You're watching the movie and you say, why are these dancers trying to play basketball?